In Ontario, education in Canada is the responsibility of the province. But the way we do it is different than in Israel. Each community elects a school board. Politicians are they're a government to run the school board in that community. And every school board that gets money from the government must have a committee of parents. And באנגלית, it's the Special Education Advisory Committee, SEAC, אומרים SEAC. They don't make any decisions. They only give advice. And the school board can listen to their advice or can ignore their advice. Often, from what we have heard, the school boards don't really listen. And the parents don't know איך לעשות סינגור, okay? How to do effective advocacy. And I don't fault the parents. They're busy. They've got children with disabilities. They may not be trained, as I've been fortunate to be trained in law school, to be an advocate. Well, the biggest school board in Canada is the Toronto District School Board. I got on its Special Education Advisory Committee a year ago, and starting in January, I began to serve as its chair. It is a wonderful committee with great parents representing organizations for blindness, deafness, autism, intellectual disability, Down syndrome, learning disabilities. It's the United Nations of disabilities. Wonderful people. But this committee, up until now, was very frustrated because they didn't know as much as they could how to get their voice heard. And I don't criticize the people, they're wonderful people. But I said when I become their chair, I want to make their voice heard. And so that's what brings me to you today. I'm not here to tell you that Canada is doing a great job for our children, and that if only Israel could be as wonderful as Canada, Israel would be a great place. In fact, I think that while we're doing a number of good things, we are far behind the United States. We are decades behind the United States in the way we approach the rights of children with disabilities in school. And I want to change that. So, what's the problem? What do I think the problem is? I'm going to tell you what our problem is, and you think about it and see if it fits here. Not for me to tell you what's happening in Israel, for you to tell me. The problem is a very big problem. And it's not only a problem in our schools. Our world, our country, has been designed for years and years and years on a crazy idea, on a ridiculous idea, on a false idea. And the idea is that the only people it's there for are people who have no disability. So we used to design subway stations and buses and workplaces and colleges and universities and stores, all on the idea that the people who would go there are people who have no disability at all. Well, that's ridiculous. Because many people have disabilities. In Ontario, over 1.8 million. Across Canada, over 4 million. Around the world, as many as 1 billion. But those numbers underestimate how many people have disabilities. When I speak to an audience like this, I always say, "יש לי שאלה." I'm going to do a survey. I want to find out if this subject touches you, if it's relevant to you. I want you to raise your hand if you have no disability right now, and if you know you will never ever get one. Raise your hand. And anyway, we are the minority of everybody. We are the minority of everybody. Everybody either has a disability now or gets one later. So to build a world full of accessibility barriers is to build a world that hurts not a minority, but a world that hurts everyone. Now let's talk about, and so the advocacy that I and others do in Canada on accessibility is about creating a world for everyone rather than a world for no one. Jobs, workplaces, products, software, websites, and so on, everything. Now let's talk about schools. Our education system in Canada is built and designed on the same ridiculous idea that I just described. Our school buildings are built for students and teachers and parents with no mobility disability. It's idiotic. I asked, as chair of SEAC, I asked the senior people at our school board, how many schools do we have in Toronto? It's the biggest school board in Canada. We have 240,000 students. We have 46,000 students who are called special education students. 1 out of every 6. Now that's not all students with mobility disabilities. Some of them have a mobility disability. But out of our 550 schools, our school board, I asked, how many of our schools are accessible? You should, in terms of physical access. And the answer was 85. 85 out of 550. It's ridiculous. Teachers with disabilities can't go in, parents with disabilities, grandparents with disabilities, and students with mobility disabilities, they can't go in. They can't go in. How do you get an education? That's just one example. It's worse. The teachers who teach in our classrooms go to teachers' college not to learn to teach everyone, but to learn to teach the 5 out of 6 students who don't have special needs. They are taught not to teach everybody, they're actually taught in a way that ensures they won't know how to teach 1 out of every 6 kids. That's ridiculous. In fact, if it was the 1970s, what you would be told in Ontario is there are 2 kinds of students. Normal students, they used to use the word normal, and then students with exceptionalities.
Well, thank you.
We don't have the word normal anymore, but they still talk about exceptionalities. The school system is designed for so-called normal students, but not for the exceptions. Well, I'm not an exception, I'm a human being. What message are we telling children if we tell them that 1 out of every 6 children is not normal? It's absurd. But it isn't just the buildings, and it isn't just the training for the teachers. Well, by the way, what we do is the regular school is for normal students. For everybody else, they get חינוך מיוחד, special education. Even the name is insulting. Special needs. I don't have a special need. I just want to learn how to read, like every other kid. That's not a special need. It's the exact same need as every kid. Every child goes to school to learn. They have one need, to learn. It's not special. It's the same for everybody. We don't all learn the same, but that doesn't make one group special or exceptional. The whole idea that the whole system is designed on is wrong. But it isn't just the buildings, and it isn't just the teachers. The equipment, the gym equipment, the playground equipment, again, assumes no disabilities. Well, if we buy new equipment, we don't have the money. Well, that's because you spent all the money on 5 out of 6 of the kids, ignoring the rest of them. That's wrong. But it isn't just the buildings, and it isn't just the teachers, and it isn't just the equipment, the gym equipment. There's the computers and the software. There is some computers and some software which people of all abilities are more able to use because they're designed with accessibility in mind. And there's others that have barriers. We need our school boards to make sure that they only buy computers and software that can be used by, if not everybody, as many kids as possible. Now the old way we used to, well actually I'll come back to that in a minute. It isn't just the buildings and the teachers' training and the gym equipment and the playgrounds and the computers. There's one more thing that's really important. The curriculum. The curriculum historically was designed for kids who they considered normal. It was never designed to take into account the learning needs of children of differing abilities, children with different disabilities. When you talk about shilov, when you talk about inclusion, you make it much, not you, but a government makes it much harder if we say, we want to include this child with a disability, but by the way, the building may be one they can't get into, and the teacher doesn't know how to teach them, and the curriculum can't accommodate them, and the equipment they use out in gym is something they can't use. And by the way, the computer software, oh right, you just pick software, but your kid can't use that either, or some of this. It's making shilov much harder to do. And shilov doesn't mean taking a kid with a disability and just dropping them in a classroom of children without disabilities and say, have a good time. And it's not having a kid with a disability in the classroom with an education assistant in the back of the room giving them a private lesson. That's segregation, but without the walls. Shilov is providing an environment where they can take part, they can fully participate, and providing the supports they need to fully participate. So, let me stop talking about education for 1 minute, and let me start talking about computers and cell phones. When I was in law school, they didn't have personal computers and they didn't have cell phones. Then they started coming out with them. But guess what? To use those computers, you had to be able to see what was on the screen and use your fingers to type. And for people with different disabilities, that presented a problem. If you were blind, you couldn't read the screen. If you couldn't use your hands effectively, you couldn't type on the keyboard. If you couldn't use a mouse, you had a problem. If you were dyslexic, you had a problem. So what do? Well, the people who made the mainstream computers, like Microsoft, they didn't do anything for us. Nothing. They designed their products for people who didn't have these disabilities. And then private companies developed software that you could buy, or equipment you could buy that you could add to the computer to make it accessible for us. So you spend money on the computer and on the regular software, and then you had to, what's the technical term in English? Is adaptive technology, or AT. So I would have to buy, or my employer would have to buy a screen reading program. Initially they were in English, then they came along in Hebrew, and try to be able to read what's on the computer screen. But then, that cost a lot of money, beyond the cost of the computer. And it was an extra cost just for people with these disabilities. And then, what would happen is, shortly after, Microsoft would say, oh, we've got a new version of Windows. And then we couldn't use it anymore. So then the adaptive technology companies had to go and write new software, and then we had to go learn it again to be able to do what we were able to do on the old computer. That was the old way. There's a new way when designing products. And the term we use, באנגלית, לא יודע איך להגיד את זה בעברית, זה universal design.
עיצוב אוניברסלי, תכנון אוניברסלי.
Okay, thank you. To include in the product features so that everyone can use them. And one of the best, probably the company that's done the best of this, I don't work for them, is Apple. Starting a few years ago, every Apple computer, I'm just speaking as a blind person to give you one example, every Apple computer has a screen reader, was a voiceover, and it's built in, it's free. If you have an Apple computer right now, I could turn that on, one keystroke, and I'm using it. Every iPod, iPad, iPhone have them. I have an iPhone on my hip. I set it up. My wife is sighted. I set up her phone. I taught her how to use it. Universal design is when you build these features in. So if you think about designing a building, having ramps, not just steps, having braille on the elevator, that's part of universal design. Building it the right way the first time. Well, I'm talking about products. The big term that's popular in the United States, and that we're trying to advocate for in Canada, is universal design in learning. UDL. Taking the same idea for the iPhone and transferring it to the school. But we're not just talking about the building. We're talking about the training of teachers. Making sure they're trained to teach children of all ability. You introduce into a mainstream class a child with a disability and the teacher there doesn't have the slightest idea what to do, they're terrified. Well, that's a formula for failure. If you introduce them into a class and the teacher starts with a lesson plan for the class, but one which a child with a particular disability can't do, or it's really hard for them to do, or it'll take a lot of work to enable them to do it, you got a problem. Universal design and learning looks at the curriculum. How can we teach this lesson in a way that makes it easiest to include all children, or as many as possible? That's universal design in learning. It requires us to rethink the way we do education from the very start. The buildings, the teacher training, the curriculum, everything. And if we don't use that idea, Shילוב, we can do it for some kids, but it's much harder. And there's more resistance. There's more opposition from teachers and so on. So, sounds like a great idea. How do you do it? Well, let me suggest a few ideas. And these are ideas that we are discussing at my Special Education Advisory Committee and that my coalition that I lead across Ontario is addressing. And you can decide if these ideas help you. there are two separate and important strategies that we need to use at the same time. You can't just do one, you just can't just do the other. You really have to do both. Let me tell you what they are, and then let me explore them. The first strategy is we have to get our schools, and our school, in Ontario it would be our school boards, in your case it would be the education ministry, to implement standards for accessible, inclusive education. And the second thing we need to do is we need to provide parents and families with a fair, fast, effective way to advocate for their children's needs in school. So let me turn to the first area. Every school in Israel, in Ontario, wherever, will have to address each of the problems I talked about. Barriers, physical barriers in the building, and limitations in the teacher's training, and the curriculum that may not make universal design in learning as easy to do, and the equipment used in the classroom, and the gym equipment in the gym, and the playground equipment in the playground. Now there's two ways to go about that, one of which is we leave it to every school to figure it out themselves. Every school principal, every teacher is going to have to go out and figure it out themselves. Gee, what computer should I use in my classroom so children with disabilities? What could be stupider than leaving it to every school, every principal, and every teacher to have to reinvent the same accessibility wheel? It'll take forever. It'll never happen. It won't work. So the solution is to come up with some rules. In Ontario we call them accessibility standards that explain if you're going to build a new school, here are the things you need to include. If you're going to buy new gym equipment, here are the features you should make sure it has. If you're going to get computers for the classroom or software, here are the kind of things it should have available. And so on. Similarly, we should be setting requirements for training teachers so that they know how to work with all children, not just some children. Now you might say, that's great for new buildings and new teachers and new gym equipment. What about the old ones? Well, I live in the real world. So do my colleagues on my Special Education Advisory Committee. We know that there's limited amount of money. But even then, we could set rules or standards to make things better. We could set requirements for if teachers need to do any retraining during their professional career, including more training on how to work with all kids, not just some kids. If a school building lacks physical accessibility, let's at least decide that we aren't going to invest more public money on an old building if it's never going to become accessible. let's spend our money, באנגלית אומרים, don't throw good money after bad money. In Toronto, we happen to have we have fewer and fewer children, and therefore they're going to close some schools, some school buildings. So I propose that they should close inaccessible schools, never accessible schools. Don't make it worse. I propose that if they're going to make a renovation to a school building, it should only be a renovation that increases accessibility. Don't spend money on the second floor of a school building that you can't get to by elevator. We don't have that much money, let's not use it in the wrong place. There are strategies that could make things better even among the people and the buildings we have now. Now, and in fact, my committee is proposing, when I get back home in a week and a half, we've debated, and I'm hoping on the 13th of June, we will be passing motions with very detailed recommendations to our board of education, our school board, about what to do about buildings and what to do about digital accessibility. About the accessibility of their websites, their equipment in the classroom, and so on. And I'm happy to send Jean a copy of them and she can share them with you. That doesn't mean the board is going to listen to me. Then we have to become advocates to persuade them that they've got to listen to us. But first we've got to set the table by asking for the things, setting up the things we need. So that's and I'm going to talk in a couple of minutes about advocacy strategies, briefly. That's the first issue. If you want to do shילוב, you've got to come up with, it's important for schools to ready themselves to be a more welcoming place for children with disabilities to be included. בשביל אלה שמתרגמים בשבילי, אני מדבר מספיק לאט או?
Oh, wonderful.
תודה.
יעל יושבי is English translation.
תודה רבה. כל הערב חשבתי איך אני יכול לעשות את זה בעברית.
אחריהם צהריים. אחריהם תתרגל אחריהם צהריים.
יש גשם על הפריד שלי, מה אני יכול? מוכן?
כן, תודה.
Okay, so that's part of the problem. And by the way, let me talk about one more part of that side of things. And my committee hasn't started to work on this, but at our meeting in June, we're going to start, or I hope we're going to start our discussion of this issue. It is very important, if we're going to include children with disabilities in the mainstream classroom, that children without disabilities learn about children with disabilities so that we can reduce problems like bullying and misunderstanding, and we can increase the acceptance of children with disabilities. I'm sure I don't need to persuade you here that a huge advantage of shילוב is that kids without disabilities learn about kids with disabilities and they grow up to become adults who are accepting of people with disabilities, and if they're hiring people, they'll be more willing to hire people with disabilities. There's all these advantages. It's also very important for children with disabilities to feel not that they are a separate, inferior group, but that they're part of society. Shילוב helps achieve that. But it doesn't work if the kids without disabilities in the school tease the children with disabilities, make fun of them, bully them, aren't welcoming for them, are hurtful towards them. So one barrier, one מכשול that we have to address, not just the technology barriers, not just the building barriers, not just the curriculum barriers, we have to attack the attitude barriers. And the good news is, children learn much better than adults. That's why we send kids to school. We wouldn't waste our time sending adults to school, it's too late. So what we need to include in our school curriculum is education for all children on the importance of shילוב. Not just in education, but in society. So an important concern, we asked our government, my coalition asked our government 9 years ago to include in school curriculum training on נגישות ושילוב. They promised it, we're still waiting for it. It's one of our many battles. But if we can educate the next generation of children without disabilities about this, then the next generation of adults without disabilities are going to be far more accepting. So we need it for the future, and we need it for חינוך שילוב now. So an important area we need is education in the classroom of children without disabilities about the abilities of children with disabilities and the importance of including them. It won't just happen because a child is there. I'm going to tell you a quick story about me. When I was a little kid, I was able to read, as I said, if I held a book close to my face. Well, when I would be in a public place, and I would hold a book to my face, kids would tease me, "Oh, you read funny." I'm a little kid. It's hurtful. I went to a summer camp when I was 13. זה מחנה קיץ יהודי לרפורמים בארצות הברית, במדינה קטנה, השם שלו זה אוקנאמו, ויסקונסין, למדתי עברית שם. למדתי עברית באוקנאמו, ויסקונסין. Okay, and the first day I was in camp there, one of the counselors, who's now a rabbi in Chicago, took me for a walk to show me around the camp. What I didn't know was at the same time, another one of the counselors was talking to all the other children about the fact that David doesn't see well. He holds the book close to his face. We have to include him. We shouldn't tease him. We should make him feel like a full and equal part of the group. That night, I didn't know this happened. I went back to the cabin that night, my first night at camp, and I picked up a book to read. And I was just waiting for the teasing to start. It didn't start. All I could think is, what's the matter with these kids? What, they don't think this is funny or weird? And what I learned was by the proper 10 minutes of חינוך בנושא שילוב, the whole world for me changed. Think of how that could be done for children of all disabilities. Think of the advantage to society long term. So I've now spent my time talking with you about one of the two major things we need to do if we want to achieve inclusive education. And without a comprehensive strategy that sets these standards so that each school, parents don't have to fight every single school to reinvent the שילוב and נגישות wheel. If we do it across the entire society, we save money, we accomplish more, and we accomplish it quicker. But there's a second area. No matter what we do on all of this nigishut, we are still going to need to accommodate individual students with different disabilities. We can't, there's no way to just drop them in a regular classroom just because the building is right and the equipment is right and so on. Moreover, you can give teachers in those classrooms more training on teaching all kids, but you're not going to train every teacher how to teach a blind child Braille, because it's a specialty. And there are very, very, very few blind children who will learn Braille. Small number. It's a vital skill. You need a specialist. But you don't need to be in a school for the blind to learn it. So we will always need important support services. But we should be able to deliver them as much as possible in the mainstream classroom with the proper specialty supports. I would like to change the name from Chinuch Miyuchad and make it part of our concept of Chinuch Shilub. But whatever we call it, we're going to always need those services. And as well, there will be times where children will need to learn. Children with some disabilities will need to learn outside the mainstream classroom for part of the day. And there will be a limited number of children with disabilities that are more complex that will need a more supported environment. But even they should have the opportunity to benefit from the mainstream setting. So that, for example, I would advocate for, even if there is a classroom dedicated only to children with a certain kind of disability or a certain kind of need, it should be in a mainstream school. So they can have recess with the other children, and we could try to include them in parts of the day with the other children. So they're not segregated in a separate building. Now this is controversial. Mostly that's what happens in Ontario. There are a couple of schools, a small number of schools in Ontario that are exclusively for learning disabilities or certain other cases. And the government is doing a review considering whether they should close them. Parents with children in those schools are protesting against this. It's raising a huge controversy. And I'm not addressing the question whether there needs to be those support services, but I'm telling you that wherever we can provide, if we have to have a child with a disability in a separate classroom, it should, wherever possible, be in a mainstream school, to enable the child to, even if they do gym with the mainstream class or music or whatever it may be, to give the opportunity to try. It's good for the kids with disabilities, it's good for the kids without disabilities. But whatever we do, we will still need some teachers with specialty skills and specialty training. And the school board will still need to make individual decisions on each case to decide what is the best support that the child needs. And that's the second area I want to talk to you about. Now, in the United States, in this area, they're way ahead of Canada. Parents have all sorts of legal rights. They can take the school board to court. There's all sorts of things they can do to enforce their right to a free, appropriate education in the least restrictive environment under national legislation that was passed in the 1970s in the United States. In Ontario, our laws don't provide that kind of full guarantee of fair procedure. If you're unhappy, you can always sue the school board under our Human Rights Code. But that's like my battle with the Toronto Transit Commission. It takes a long time. It's very frustrating. You can end up having to hire lawyers. It's awful. No one wants to do it unless they absolutely have to. So my Special Education Advisory Committee, we've looked at this and we've identified two very important needs. And in June, I am hoping we will be passing 2 resolutions on these. What are the 2 needs? When I describe them to you, you're going to say, what, you need to convince something of this? First, parents need to be able to find out what options are available for their children and how to advocate. I describe what we have heard over and over from parents is that it's very hard just to find out what the options are. I've been on television in Toronto describing the Toronto District School Board כמו מסעדה שאין להם תפריט. או אם יש תפריט, לא נותנים. Okay? Literally, it can be very hard. I have 3 law students who volunteered for me who are now exploring the website and phoning the school board as if they're parents, just trying to find out basic information. באנגלית קוראים להם secret shoppers. Because we want to be able to document how difficult it is. Just to find out what the options are for my child, whoever my child may be, and who to go to, who to find out from. If you're not happy with what they're offering, who to complain to. So our first proposal that we're debating is a series of recommendations on making this information available and easily available. And available to parents in plain language, because not all parents are lawyers. Some of them are construction workers. Some of them don't have much education. And not just in English or French. Toronto has a very significant, if you come to Toronto, we have amazing restaurants from all around the world, because we have amazing people from all around the world. And they speak all sorts of different languages. They send their children to our schools. So they should be able to find out too. So that's our first resolution. And you say, like, should you have to fight to just find out? And the answer is, yes, we do. So we're trying to change that. And the other thing that we are proposing is that there should be a much more fair and quick process that includes the parents at all stages in decisions over what accommodations will be provided to your child and what supports and services. And if you don't like what they offer you, there should be, I'm proposing and we're considering recommending that there should be a right of appeal within the school board itself. So that you don't have to go running to the Human Rights Commission and hiring a Human Rights Tribunal and hiring lawyers and all of that. And we're also considering recommending, and I strongly support that if the school board has agreed to provide certain accommodations, but you think they're not actually delivering on what they said they would do, there should also be an appeal process for that to ensure that they deliver what they said they would do. Now, let me conclude for just a couple of minutes by talking about what I've learned about Sigur. I could talk for a long time about it, but in the education area, I'm going to offer you just a few ideas. The first idea is that every parent of every child, no matter what their disability is facing the exact same problem. It may be that their child have different needs. Blind children need to learn Braille. Deaf children may need to learn sign language, children with autism may need interventions for communication and behavior learning. But they all are facing a school system that had the problem I started with. A school system that wasn't designed for them, as if they were equal participants. So, parents are the strongest when parents are united, no matter what their disabilities are. I learned this starting years ago when we were fighting for amendments to our Charter of Rights, to our Human Rights Code in the 1980s, and when we fought for our accessibility law from 1994 to 2005. Governments like to divide people. They like to tell deaf people, we'd love to give you what you need, but the blind people are asking for Braille. And they like to tell blind people, we'd love to give you more access to Braille and accessible websites, but the people in wheelchairs are demanding ramps. And then they want you to fight each other, rather than advocate the government. Our solution in the 90s, when fighting for an accessibility law, was to have blind people talking about the need for sign language, and deaf people talking about the need for ramps, and people in wheelchairs talking about the need for Braille. Mbinim? The message is clear. You aren't going to divide us. We are together. And if they say, well, you've got to set priorities, you say, yeah, we got one priority, nigishut. It's easy. It's just one priority, and it applies to all of us, and we're not trading off any of us against anybody else. Let me talk to you about numbers. In the Toronto District School Board, there are 46,000 children designated as special education. Across the province of Ontario, there are 334,000. If those parents, that means 334,000 families. Politicians understand those kind of numbers if they see that they're united together. So the goal that I see in a coalition is bringing parents together with a united message. And here the united message is really three things. Parents and families should know what they'll be able to easily know what the choices are and how to advocate. There should be a fair and quick process to be heard and to appeal. And we need clear rules on nגישות לחינוך, on inclusive, universal design in learning. And if we can unite around three ideas, and they're ideas that share all the needs of all of our children, then we are the strongest. And the last thing I'm going to tell you about what I'm learning about, and by the way, this has helped our Special Education Advisory Committee work together, share really good ideas together, come together, and be, I believe, a really effective voice. And I think that there's nothing unique about Toronto, that these are principles that can apply to everyone. There's one more thing I want to tell you, and then I'm going to conclude, about Singur in this area. If there's one thing I have learned about parents of children with disabilities, it's this. They're tired, they're busy, they're overloaded, they're scared. They want the best for their child. All parents are tired, and all parents are overloaded, and all parents are busy, and all parents are scared. But they've got the addition that parents of kids without disabilities don't have, which is they're going to a school system where it's not designed for their kids, and they got to fight. They got to fight for the basics that other parents of other kids don't have to fight for, because the school system just delivers it. May not deliver it well in some places, maybe better, but they're exhausted. So when we do advocacy most effectively is when we make it easiest for parents to add their voices. If we expect every parent to write a letter to the Minister of Education spelling out in detail what our accessibility regulations should include, forget it. By the time the kid goes to bed, they want to go to bed. So where a coalition can be the most effective, in my view, whether it's a special education advisory committee or a coalition here, is where you come up with an agenda that speaks to everybody, that there's no other side to the argument. What, parents shouldn't know what their options are? What, the school board should not have to listen to parents? What, schools should each have to reinvent the Ngi'shut wheel? Who's going to argue any of those ideas? They're ridiculous. So you come up with arguments where there's only one side to the argument, where all parents can see their child's needs reflected in them, and where we give parents an easy way to add their voice. Now, I could give you, I'm going to be talking this afternoon to Betizzi staff on more about how to take these principles in coalition building, and כשאני חוזר לארץ, אם רוצים לדבר על זה עוד פעם, אני ממש אוהב ללמד על זה. This is like an advertisement. אז היה נהדר לפגש אתכם, ואם יש, I don't know, אם יש זמן לשאלות, אני יכול לענות.
אנחנו קצת קצרים בזמן, אבל אנחנו נאפשר שאלה אחת או שתיים אם יש אנשים שרוצים לשאול. But I will ask you the group of the community division. מישהו רוצה משהו לשאול? So, thank you very much. תודה רבה.